Dr. Joel Weinberger, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, David. Nice to be here.
Well, it's really great to have you here. We're going to be, I'm eager to speak with you about your new book. I've got a copy right here. The Unconscious Theory, Research, and Clinical Interpretations. For my viewers, this is what the book looks like. It's about this thick, about under 300 pages, I believe, which amazingly you cover everything.
I tried. Thank you.
in that amount of space is something else. So I understand you're both a researcher and a clinician, right?
That's correct. I teach at a university where I do research on unconscious processes. I also have a small clinical practice, and I do consulting for politicians, nonprofits, and businesses. And then sometimes I sleep.
Well, sometimes you sleep, right? Right. I'll be interested that towards the end, we'll kind of get into some of that consulting work, I hope. So what's the story behind this book?
All right. So what happened is way back in the day when I was a graduate student, uh,
Oh,
yes, during the Civil War, the unconscious was actually 1970s, late 1970s. Unconscious processes were controversial, and I'm sitting in a class, and my professor is telling me they don't exist,
oh boy.
and I'm sitting there going, "You got to be crazy! How do they not exist?" And so I started thinking it can't be that people really believe they don't exist. There must be some kind of cultural, philosophical something or other that led people to this kind of a conclusion. So that's kind of the first couple of chapters is me trying to get through the history. That's where that came from. Then I became a clinical psychologist, and I practiced psychodynamic psychotherapy, where the unconscious is kind of central to everything. But the unconscious was always screwed up. It messed you up, it made you crazy. And I started thinking, this would not have developed and evolved if it was maladaptive. It has to serve a good function as well. Plus, they didn't do much research on it in the clinical community. So that got me interested in doing research and interested in looking at the normative aspects, as I call it, of unconscious processes, which can go wrong, like anything can go wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
Your leg can go wrong too, but it was there for a good reason.
Yeah, that's very helpful for me to know about that history because I share psychodynamic training from graduate school, and then I went on and explored a lot of other clinical things. But there's so many questions really about the unconscious, and your book is very substantial, authoritative, detailed, and in the roughly hour that we have to go into all, there's not going to be time to go into all the rich detail that it deserves. So I'm going to be asking you for more or less the view from 40,000 feet. And
Okay,
you're already off to a good start, I think, in
thank you.
giving us that. So maybe you can take us through the major historical stepping stones, from the 40,000 feet. Uh,
So,
up to the contributions of neuroscience, and then we'll dig into those separately.
okay, it really goes back in the way I look at it to Descartes, who basically we all know he said, "I think, therefore I am." But if you really dig into it without getting into the weeds, you can't say "I think, but I'm not aware of what I think, therefore I am." So it became, "I am conscious, therefore I am." And he said there's only two things in the world, the mind and the physical universe, the mental and the physical. So if it's not mental, it's physical, and mental is consciousness. So therefore the unconscious doesn't exist, is really putting it in a nutshell.
Hmm.
And then there were all these philosophical arguments, but a lot of them went into mysticism. Mysticism wasn't all that popular. And then when psychology as a field was founded by Wundt, it was founded as a study of consciousness. And then up came behaviorism, and instead of adding the unconscious, they threw out consciousness too. And now you
Yeah,
had no
the
mind
black
whatsoever.
box.
The black box,
Yeah.
exactly correct. And so now you had no mind whatsoever. And then, and then finally, some people started noticing that something goes on inside your head. We had what's called the cognitive revolution, and that was in the late 60s and 70s, and it finally eventuated in the 90s into some genuine research on unconscious processes. I came in around then, early 90s, And at the time, it was very controversial. Now I'm mainstream. I moved from pariah to mainstream without moving. And then I decided to write this book and to cover all of that, and then to cover the research that got us to where we are. And then, as you point out, into the cognitive neuroscience stuff, not because I wanted to go there, but that's where I had to end up in order.
Yeah. So tell us about the neuroscience. What have we learned from the neuroscience? How has that refined our understanding?
All right. So if you look at cognitive neuroscience, the unconscious becomes necessary and consciousness becomes the mystery. It kind of turns the world on its head, so to speak. So you have in one model, there are three basic models. I'll try and speak to them quickly. One is called massive modularity. That's the one most of us know, where you have a little piece in your head that does this and another piece in your head that does that. You know, one part deals with emotion and one part deals with speech and so on.
What did you call that?
Massive modularity, meaning you have modules in your head.
Oh, modularity. Okay.
Hundreds, if not thousands of these things. And they don't talk to each other very much, if at all. And there's no module for consciousness. They can't find it. They haven't thought about it. So they kind of scratched their heads and either made consciousness illusory. Gazzaniga, the guy who found the split brain, said that there's another module. He calls it the interpreter. That really isn't conscious. It just provides a running commentary of what you've done. So now there's no consciousness. And there are others, or there's some kind of central space where things come together. That's what Fodor said, Eugene Fodor. And then another model, which is called parallel distributed processing, says, well, you've got whenever neurons fire together, they get connected by virtue of firing together. And so you have this great plasticity of the brain, and they have no room for consciousness in there either. And then finally, you have something called neural reuse, which is the one that I prefer, by a guy named Michael Anderson. And he says, well, you know, it's really kind of a combination. I'm simplifying it for purposes of us talking about it, where you don't have these big modules. You have smaller things that he calls workings that do what they do. And you can combine them in a bunch of different ways, and you end up with the mind. But he also has no room for consciousness. So now the mystery to me is, and I maybe that's the next step, is, well, what happened to consciousness? We used to not have unconsciousness. Now we don't have consciousness. But you need those models to explain learning unconsciously, memory unconsciously, what's called embodied cognition, which is to say that the mind and the body are actually not separated. That, for example, if I were to raise the temperature in a room so it's warmer, you will actually feel friendlier. Likewise, if you feel friendlier, you'll think the temperature in the room is warmer, because the same circuits are firing for both physical warmth and emotional warmth. And distance is the same thing, and so on and so forth. So you need a model of the mind-brain in order to explain all of that.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot.
I hope
So
it's too
what
much.
did Freud and the psychodynamic school get right about the unconscious, and what did they get wrong?
What they got right was that most of our functioning is a result of unconscious processes, and that consciousness is secondary to it. And it exists, but it's much less important. That early experiences affect us in a grander, more broad way than later experiences. So they got all of that right. What they got wrong was they saw it in terms of pathology, which is understandable because they were seeing people who were troubled,
Yeah.
and they saw everything that could go wrong, but they didn't see everything that could go right. And most of the time, things go right. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so that's fascinating. I'm struck by what they got right. You know, that basically the idea of associations, which you get into later in your book, that's an associational model, which I think people probably thought even before Freud, but certainly it was in his theory. And one of the things that drew me to Carl Jung was that he had a more expanded view of the unconscious than Freud did, because Freud's view was it seemed exclusively focused on pathology. And Jung saw that, wait a second, there's more going on than that. There's also our higher aspirations and so on are reflected in the unconscious as well.
He was absolutely right about that. Without getting into the specifics of his collective unconscious, the idea that you need to integrate the unconscious parts of your mind with the conscious parts of your mind and come to terms with it, I think is a great contribution that he made. You don't have to overcome it, like Freud seemed to indicate. You don't have to defeat it. You don't have to make it conscious. You just have to make it part of who you are and recognize it for what it is. And Jung said that, and I think he said it very nicely with a lot of his symbolic kinds of writings and so on.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the collective unconscious, and I have to say I've been having some fresh thoughts about that
Yeah.
because of the findings of genetics and epigenetics that it appears that that the things that happen to you may get passed on in some ways to your offspring and maybe even further.
Yeah.
And likewise, that you come into the world with some information, unconscious information, in fact.
You know, this was one of the criticisms originally of Jung, that he was Lamarckian. He, acquired characteristics, and we know that not to be true. It's been debunked. Well, it turns out that recent research shows that there is truth to it, and
Mm,
that something happens to your genes through your lifetime that actually you can pass on to offspring. We don't quite understand it yet. We don't know how it works because it seems anti-evolutionary, but it's happening. It's not quite the giraffe has a long neck from stretching its neck over generations, but experiences do affect genes. We now know that to be true, and Jung turned out to be right.
yeah, yeah. Um, so, is there, what's the role of motivated forgetting? You know, the psychodynamic view is one that says that the unconscious, um, well, it plays a role in the development of symptoms and in lots of other areas, like according to Freud, slips of the tongue, dreams, etc. Does this latest science, the neuroscience, obviate that, get rid of that?
No, but it gives it a totally different outlook, a different kind of context. The Freudian way, or this as a psychoanalytic way, looks at it as a defense. That is, that something makes me uncomfortable, so I don't want to deal with it because anxiety is unpleasant. So I find a way around it, either by forgetting it, by blaming you for it, by rationalizing it. All the standard defenses that the psychoanalysts write about. But it turns out that what's really going on, or at least what we now believe is going on, is that there's all these normal kinds of processes going on where you learn consciously one thing and unconsciously another thing, and they may either, if they run in sync, great, good for you, you got a win-win. But sometimes they don't run in sync, in which case you say one thing and believe another, and it's not because you're defending against it, it's because you've learned two different things, and depending on the context in which you happen to be talking or behaving, you'll do one or you'll do the other.
Yeah. What about what has been a very contentious area of motivated forgetting in court trials and so on, that uh, people who've suffered abuse of one sort or another uh, say that they don't remember, and other people say, oh, they're forgetting them, they're confused. What do they say?
So there is such a thing called implicit memory. It does exist. And
Okay.
implicit memory is defined by, you say you don't remember something, but you act as if you do remember it, but you're telling the truth. You don't actually consciously recall it. That does exist. And then we get into politics and we get into court cases. And of course, I don't know what's on the minds of these defendants and these prosecutors, and what they actually remember or don't remember, but I do know people are suggestible. Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated that quite clearly. Her research is good in that area. But I think she went too far in that, in fact, there are experiences that we've had that we act as though we've had it. But for example, my son, when he was a year and a half old, 15 months exactly, I remember it because my other son was born right then. A door was slammed on his finger at the daycare center and almost severed his finger. And I had to go to the emergency room and they sewed it back on. And the doctor assured me not to worry, he'll remember nothing. And I wanted to slug the guy because I knew about implicit memory. Well, he doesn't remember it other than he remembers me telling him about it, but he does not like the sound of a slammed door. You slam a door, he jumps.
Wow.
You
Yep.
ask him, why do you jump? He says, it was loud, it startled me, but I know the real reason he jumps. And it's not because of defense, and it's not because of repression. It's because he was young and his explicit memory wasn't fully developed, and he has an implicit memory. Well, that can happen later on in life if you're not noticing what's going on, but certain contingencies are happening, and you act as though you've learned them and remember them, but you didn't really pay conscious attention. And so you say, no, I don't remember that. And you don't, but you still behave as though you do remember it. So there's a kind of a split between the two sometimes.
Yeah. I wonder if does that make room for subliminal, um, I would think it does, for the whole issue of subliminal suggestion used by the advertising agency,
Okay,
not agency, industry.
I know what you mean. I actually have done research in subliminal. You can't get somebody to dance like a chicken or buy popcorn, but what you can do is prime things that are available to them. And so you can suggest things but it's not like you can make them commit murder and turn them into the Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah.
What you can do is you can suggest, that they might be thirsty, but that doesn't mean they'll buy Coca-Cola. If they happen to be thirsty, if they happen to like Coca-Cola, you can make it more likely, but you're not going to turn someone into something. So, for example, they did a study, and not a study, they did an ad in the 2000 election, Bush versus Gore. And we did a study on this. And the Bush campaign put up the word rats subliminally over a picture of Al Gore.
Huh.
And they denied it, but then they slowed it down, and there it was. Then they said they really meant Democrats, and they just spread the word out. And then they said, well, it doesn't work anyway. But if you don't like Gore, and you see the word rats associated with Gore, you're going to really not like Gore. Or we did another study where I don't know if you remember, but Gore wouldn't use Bill Clinton because of the scandal and so on and so forth. And we didn't have the technology then, but later we did when Gray Davis, the former governor of California, was in a recall vote, and he wouldn't use Bill Clinton. So a week before the election, we presented a subliminal picture of Bill Clinton before a picture of Gray Davis in California to voters, and we asked them to rate Gray Davis. Well, if you were a Republican, Gray Davis was a Democrat, you didn't like him. And if you put Bill Clinton in front of him, you still didn't like him. If you were a Democrat, you didn't dislike him so much, and Bill Clinton didn't have much of an effect either. But if you were an independent, if you were someone on the fence, the subliminal image of Bill Clinton made your negativity go way down on Gray Davis. So that was an effect of a subliminal stimulus, but it only affects you if you're open to it. It's not magic.
You reminded me of a bunch of social psychological experiments where something, generally there is a research assistant, maybe who does something, and it's not noticed, it's not remembered by the subject, but it clearly happened and it clearly exerted some influence.
Yeah, I think the king of these studies is a guy named John Barge, who was a great social psychologist at Yale. And he did a study where he had his associate hand someone either a warm beverage or a cool beverage. And then they interviewed someone for a job. After the warm beverage, they were more likely to hire the person than after the cold beverage, simply because they were primed with warmth and felt warmly towards the person. So again, they didn't have any axe to grind. It wouldn't work if they hated the guy or they loved the guy, but it worked because they were neutral to the guy. They just saw his answers in a more positive light with the warm than with the cold, and they were totally unaware of the manipulation. In another one, this is my favorite.
That story kind of edges into, makes me think about metaphor, and
Absolutely.
maybe that's something about how metaphor works in the brain.
That is actually in the book. I say that, and I think you hit on something that's really relevant. Metaphors are always physical. Depression is a load that you carry. it's really the same part of the brain. So when you're talking about, I feel close to somebody, they don't have to be next to you, but it's the same part of the brain that deals with distance as deals with your emotional feeling of intimacy.
That's
So,
fascinating.
so they've done studies where they've shown people further apart versus closer together, and then the person feels more friendly to the next person, just on the basis of dots or pictures being close or far apart.
I think you also discuss mirror neurons, and maybe that's kind of edges into the same area as well.
Yeah, mirror neurons are a little bit controversial, but the point of them is that when you see someone behave in a certain way, it was originally done with monkeys, but it seems to work with humans too. The same neurons that would fire if you were doing the action fire when you watch someone else do the action. So a nice example is if you see someone in pain, your pain receptors actually fire, your own pain receptors.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you feel pain because someone else is feeling pain. Further, if it's someone you like, you feel more pain than if it's a stranger. But it's actual pain receptors that are firing because you see someone else in pain, or you see someone lifting an object. The neurons that would cause you to lift an object fire. You don't necessarily lift it, but that's how you have a kind of an empathy for somebody else's behavior. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the magic of mirror neurons, why they become so hot.
Does that have something to do with why we can cry in a movie,
Yes.
but don't ever cry outside of movies?
Well, you see someone, a good actor, portraying an affect in a situation that you
Yeah.
can relate to, and those neurons will be fired inside your head as if it was happening to you.
Yeah.
You'll feel angry towards the villain. You'll feel sad towards the tragic figure. Those are examples of what's called embodied cognition or mirror neurons, and they happen. And you
Yeah.
see babies. If someone cries around the baby will start crying.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. We had twins, and if one would start crying, the other one would start crying.
Mine are 15 months apart, Irish twins.
Oh. uh, what about dreaming? Getting back to the psychodynamic stuff. I mean, um, what's your own thought about dreams, and do dreams? I mean, I've taught classes on dreaming and kept dream journals, and so I'm convinced that dreams are impacted by our emotions, our conflicts, things that are going on in our life, that they're
I,
reflective.
I don't know a lot about dreams per se, so I think you're right. I think that what has entered your head during the day is going to trigger neurons in your head at night. Why wouldn't it? It only makes sense that it would. It'll trigger them associatively, though. It won't trigger them directly, which is why dreams have to be interpreted associatively rather than concretely and directly. So what you get is an associative connection
Uh-huh.
to whatever it is that's concerning you during the day. So
Yeah.
that's why you can fly in dreams and fall and so on and so forth. But if you think about them and you associate to them, you'll get to the activity or the concern that you have, I believe.
Yeah, me too. Okay. Now, you and your co-author, you have a co-author. Um, Remind me of her name. I can't
Valentina
here in front of
Stoycheva.
me. Yeah, Valentina. Yeah. Um, you developed a theory of the unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
if with whatever economy you can. Well, you don't have to be that economical about it. So, tell us about the theory and what
Okay.
it asserts, and what problems does it solve?
I think that the problem I had in the book is that a lot of the research, a lot of the theorizing, you mentioned how the breadth that the book had, it had that breadth because it's being studied by so many people living in different silos who don't talk to each other.
Uh-huh.
When we took on the job of trying to understand the unconscious, we had to do chapters like, here's a chapter on this thing, here's a chapter on that thing. And so now all the chapters are done, and how in the world are we going to tie this all together? So that's where the computational neuroscience came in. we thought that the model of the mind that we came up with, that we borrowed and played with a little bit, namely neural reuse, can explain all of those things. It explains embodied cognition, because it talks about that new talents are built on top of old neurons and old workings. So that explains why I'm moving my hands when I talk, because speech was built on motor activity originally in terms of evolution. It explains implicit memory as neurons firing together without me knowing about it. Likewise, implicit memory. It explains the association of everything, because neurons, your brain is associatively connected. Neuron A is connected to B, C, D, and E, and they're connected to something else. They're not connected hierarchically. They're not connected logically. They're connected associatively, and guess what? We think associatively. So what we tried to do was tie all of those chapters together with a neuroscience model, a computational neuroscience model, and that happened to be neural reuse. And then we tried to apply it to psychotherapy, because frankly, and you know psychotherapy, there hasn't been a new theory of psychotherapy in decades. And we're all talking about Freud and post-Freudians. At best, we're talking 30 years ago. And then the cognitive people are talking about Aaron Beck. He's 30 years ago. So we thought what we need is a model of the mind. I'm not so arrogant as to think I have a great model of the mind completed, but at least a beginning. And we think that psychotherapy ought to be built on what we know about the mind and not what we speculate about it or what we knew 30 or 40 years ago. So I'm sorry if I was long-winded, but...
No, not at all. Have you heard from any critics of your theory? Are there holes that they're poking at?
No, I'm surprised. I haven't heard. I'm looking for that, to be frank, because I'm sure there are holes, and I'd learn from them. I heard from one person that, we know that neural reuse is the main model now, and so you didn't really tell me anything new. And I scratched my head, because massive modularity is Steve Pinker's model, and I would say he's pretty well known. So I'm not sure that that's true. I have not. As I said, I'm not trying to brag. I'd like to hear criticism of it. I think we wrote in the book that we know this is going to be supplanted at some point. It's just a beginning. But
you
no,
probably will at some point.
Oh, I'm sure.
Human
I hope.
beings being what they are, academics being who they are.
Yes. In papers I've submitted, I don't even want to repeat some of the criticism.
Now you talk about neural reuse, and yes. I want to make sure that people understand what you're talking about there.
Okay.
What I got from the book is that there are neural structures, and then as a new skill or environmental demand comes along, that we build on top of what's already there, kind of taking some of the function, building on that functionality, finding a new way to extend it.
That's exactly correct. So the way I think I can explain it is, we read and we write. That can't possibly have evolved. It just hasn't been enough time for reading and writing. So we had to use brain structures that already existed and reconfigure them. Whereas A was never connected to B before, now we'll connect A and B. And we're connecting. What neural reuse means is I take neurons that we used for one thing, and they're still used for that. And now I'm going to also use it for something else by hooking it with another set of neurons. They're called workings, technically speaking. And I get a whole new use out of it, namely, in this case, reading and writing. And I gave the example before, and you just showed it. I'm moving my hands while I talk. Yeah. That has nothing to do with talking. What it probably has to do with is some of the neural networks that are involved with me moving my hands, motor kinds of activities, were grabbed onto or co-opted or borrowed to help me figure out how to speak. And so speaking is partly built on movement activity of my hands. So I've reused those neurons for a whole new purpose.
Earlier, a couple of times you've used the phrase computational neuroscience. Yeah. What's the computational part?
It's a term that I'm not 100% comfortable with, but it's what they use. What it means is groups of neurons were designed to do a certain task. And that task is then called a computation. It's not like it does arithmetic.
Mm.
The task might be to detect angularity. The task might be to trigger some basic affective reaction. And it's just called a computation. So
Oh,
I take all these different computations, I reconfigure them in all kinds of new ways, because after all, I've got tens of billions of neurons to play with, and I can come up with all kinds of different novel ways of doing things, and that gives us the flexibility and the beauty of being human.
okay. Um, so how has all of this study that you've done over the years since the 70s and on, how has that impacted the way that you do therapy, if at all?
It has impacted the way I do therapy. Um, so, for example, I, perhaps more than a lot of other therapists, will explain this kind of thing to people. So, for example, one thing we didn't talk about is we human beings evolved to live in a certain environment that doesn't exist anymore. The Pleistocene era, we'll call it. We were hunter-gatherers. So we evolved to live in small family groups near a water source and, to be wary of strangers. And if something frightened us, we left. Now imagine, I had this experience actually, I wrote about it. I'm in an airplane and someone is having a panic attack in the airplane. And first they ask for, believe this or not, they ask for a doctor, okay. They ask for a nurse, then they ask for a dentist. I don't know what a dentist was supposed to do. But my wife figured out what was going on and said, well, he's a psychologist, maybe he can help. Anyway, so I go to the person and she's saying, you got to land the plane. I'm freaking out. We're in the air and we can't land the plane. So I explain, anxiety exists so you can escape from a dangerous situation. You feel you're in a dangerous situation. If you were on the ground, if you were in a real normal dangerous situation, you get up and go. Well, you can't here. That's why you're freaking out. This soothed her because I explained the purpose of anxiety to her. I didn't tell her, take a Xanax. I didn't tell her, everyone else is fine. Why are you freaking out? I didn't tell her, the authority. I explained what anxiety was. So when I see my patients, I explain that the mind works associatively. I explain that we have a gut level, immediate approach avoidance, positive, negative reaction to things. And I explain about attribution theory, which is basically that if I do it, it's because of the situation. But if you do it, it's because of your character. So therefore, if you get angry, you're an angry person. If I get angry, well, look what happened. Of course I got angry. And this leads to a lot of miscommunication between people. So I tell them those things. I
Yeah.
also have it in my mind that I must not always interpret my patients as being characterologically the way they are. It might have been situational. And I better be careful about myself because they're doing the same thing. So
Uh-huh.
it has affected what I do very much. I also am very interested in their bodily feelings because of embodied cognition. I want to know where they're feeling something, physically how it feels. And before I did this research, that was of lesser importance to me, but now it's critical to the way I
Yeah,
work.
interesting. It's uh, a big part of what you're describing is a kind of a psychoeducational approach,
Absolutely.
which and I've been tracking people who a sort of emerging field called neuropsychotherapy,
Mhm.
and it was a little misleading till I figured out it's really psychoeducation. They're explaining to people how the mind and the brain work, and just the way that you've described, rather than somehow manipulating the neurons. Although what we're finding out is that's in fact what we do when we do talk therapy. We're
Yeah,
not we're not getting in and picking at the actual physical brain matter, but talk therapy does change the brain.
that's another misconception that the medical model, I think, encourages, that I'll give you medicine which will change your brain chemistry, which it will do.
Yeah.
But talking to me will also change your brain chemistry. And if you think about it, it makes complete sense. Your experiences are going to change your brain. And so your experiences with me will change your brain. And if I know what I'm doing, I hopefully will help you change your brain for the better. And we could do it in a more fine-tuned rather than, bang it with a hammer kind of a way.
Yeah. Yeah. So earlier you mentioned at the beginning that you do various kinds of consulting, and I looked at the article that you wrote, probably just one of your columns in Psychology Today,
Uh-huh.
and you talked about using unconscious processes to address issues of tribalism, prejudice, political campaigns, product ads. And you're talking about consulting to, yeah, tell us about your consulting work and how this
Okay.
informs it.
So I have a company called Implicit Strategies. And what we do in a nutshell is everything to me is a communication and a message, whether it's an ad, it's a logo, it's a tagline, it's a spokesperson, it's a political message. I don't really care. All of those things are communications. They're all messaging. And you know, when you created this message, what you want to communicate to the person. You want them to drink Coca-Cola, you want them to vote for John Doe, whatever it is you want. And you've now crafted a message or a logo or something that you think will influence them to do that. What you don't know is what's the unconscious impact of that message. And we can measure that. And we can measure that by looking at strengths of associations. So you tell me, I want them to think that this man is honest, trustworthy, and can get the job done. Okay? So I will test those attributes, but I'll also test dishonest and just likes power, because you don't know, maybe it's in there as well. And then I'll get back to you and say, here's your top associates. So we did one, if you want to look it up, we did it on CNN in 2016 before the presidential election, in which we predicted that Trump could win, and we said why. Now, at that time, everyone said he had no shot. But based on the associations that he generated and the associations that Hillary Clinton generated, he had a psychological path to the presidency, and we were able to indicate what that path was and why he would have it. And since it was 6 months before the election, you can't accuse us of second guessing. And we'll be doing that again, I hope, in another few weeks.
So
So
you did that on the basis of interviews with people and
no,
getting the,
we do it online based on reaction time to associations. So we'll generate 15 associations, let's say 9 positive, 6 negative to a candidate that fits a political office. Could be a product, as I said, it depends what we're looking at, but in this case, a candidate. And we have people do a task. It's a simple task. It's a variant of what's called a Stroop. We say, ignore the word and just click on the color that the word is printed in, red, blue, green, or yellow. And you can do that unless you're colorblind. And but if the word resonates with you, it'll take you just a little bit longer to click on the word, because you can't help but process it, because you're associating it, let's say, with Donald Trump or with Joe Biden or with Bernie Sanders. So let's say I put in the word, democratic socialist. You're going to associate that more strongly, probably, with Joe Biden than with Donald Trump. So your reaction time to clicking on the color will be longer because you'll be reading it. And then now we're talking about 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds,
yeah.
about a half hour, but it's measurable. And then I'll have strongest to weakest associations, and I'll make a narrative out of it. I'll connect the associations and tell you the unconscious story that your message is communicating. So you'll know the unconscious story, you'll know the conscious story, you'll know what the associations are and how strong they are, and you'll have a sense of the impact that this message is having on the people you're interested in. And we can do that for Coca-Cola too, or any kind of product.
That's fascinating to me, particularly because another hat that I've worn is a marketing researcher,
Mm-hmm.
conducting focus groups to try to get it, But the marketing research industry, as you may know, they grab whatever they can from the field of psychology. And they're always looking for new tools, new ways to get in and understand people's motivations.
They are. They tend to be. This is a bias on my part. I don't think they're critical enough. They grab the flavor of the day.
Yeah, I think that's true too. I mean, often the people don't have the psychological training and background, but they'll grab a technique
Right.
and run with it.
That's right.
Also, I don't know if you're aware uh, that what you've just described, to some extent, goes back to Jung, because he did association testing. That was his research.
Word association.
Yeah,
We,
word association and measuring reaction time, right?
yeah, I think that's in the book. I hope they
Oh,
didn't.
really? I didn't see that. Yeah.
Well, they may have cut it. You were telling how it's under 300 pages. Trust me, it was 400 pages to begin with,
Yeah, right, right.
and we had to cut quite a bit. So that may have cut. But you're right. Before he kind of gave up on science at one point. But before he did that, he was quite a talented scientist, and he did a lot of work with word associations. You're absolutely right. And
Uh-huh.
people haven't picked it up. That's how he came up with the complexes, was through
Yes.
those word associations.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm glad to see that you know so much about Jung, and
So
that you've had as open-minded a involvement with the profession as you have.
thank
So,
you.
yeah, that's great. Uh, as we wrap up here, is there anything that you hoped to say, hope to get out that you haven't had a chance to do yet?
Yeah, there. I don't know if I haven't had a chance, but what I'd like to emphasize is that the unconscious is normal. It mostly helps us. We tend to focus on when it goes wrong, and sometimes it does go wrong. But for the most part, it works for us. It does what it needs to do, and it helps us live our lives. And I hope to communicate that. I also hope to communicate that it's workable, that if it does go wrong because of experiences that you've had or a bad fit, one can work with it and help people. And that
That's a
it's about time that we paid attention to it.
Hey, that's a great wrap up. I like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Joel Weinberger, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Rap Radio.
I want to thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.